Hey there, can everyone hear me okay? Testing, testing, 1 2 1 2, just making sure that everyone is able to see it. Okay, no sound. 1 second. Yeah. Okay, so I'd like to welcome everyone to our third art masterclass. This week I want to talk about optimization, and there's a few things that fall under that heading. Specifically, the three things we're going to look at today are, this may run into next week's as well, so just for reference, this may end up being quite a few different topics overall. But the first thing we're going to cover is file size optimization, specifically how you can lower the size of your scenes, which means that you get more bang for buck, means you don't need to buy bigger subscriptions with us, and it also means that end users get a much better experience visiting your environments. I'll also briefly discuss some new tools and options that will be coming forward in future editor packs. They're in the very near term, so I feel comfortable covering them today and letting you integrate them as part of your plans. The second type of optimizing we're going to talk about is frame rates, specifically making sure that all your viewers get a good experience, because frame rate matters. Particularly for older computers, mobile devices, WebGL, and VR. That's the second thing we're going to optimize. And the third thing we're going to cover is just very briefly, we're going to discuss some of the things that just help improve the upload size and the processing time of your regions, because sometimes that can be a bit of a chore if you're uploading very large amounts of content. It's best to try and trim that down if we can. So, I think for the first thing we're going to discuss is region file size, and then we're going to get into a whole bunch of other things. Now, this advice here, the advice in the previous masterclasses has been applicable to most Unity development. Today's class is going to be very tightly bound to space itself. And that means I'm going to recommend some things today that may not make sense to game developers if you're listening in, but it will make sense to you guys as space developers. And part of the reason is we're going to look at what kind of quality and things we can drop from a scene, particularly because we're bandwidth bound, whereas other Unity projects may not be so. You don't really care about the download size being something that can be streamed in at a reasonable amount of time. We're going to discuss first the types of regions that can be uploaded to space, and then the second thing we're going to discuss is actually get into the details of how we can trim file sizes down. So when you upload a scene in space, this is the scene we finished up last week. Now, I'm not going to use this scene today for more than a cursory observation, because when I actually checked in on how much file size this scene weighed in at, it came out at 34 megabytes, which is a bit too low for us to really care about. 34 megabytes is a good scene size. This actually should be fine in WebGL, which tends to discourage regions larger than about 50 to 100 megabytes worth of content. So when you upload a scene into space, you have a whole bunch of settings here on the sidebar, and we're actually going to go into quite a few of those in details. We're going to skip the virtual good settings here, and we're just going to go straight to the scene settings, where we can actually look at a few things. So the first thing today we're going to go into is the export mode. When you notice here, we've actually got several options available when you upload a scene as to what it gets processed as, and this actually indicates to our servers exactly how we split your content up and how we decide to stream it down. The default mode is the most stable, and that is the one that will always work. The other two modes have some extra complications associated with them, which I will try and get into because I think that's an important topic to cover today. So the first one is single scene, and when we're selecting this mode, what happens is that we basically bake all your content into a single archive. That single archive is shipped to the client unpacks it all at once. Now, there are some file size advantages to using this mode, particularly if you're using similar content. Not the same content, but say you've got a couple of textures where there is a slight difference painted on it, but a large percentage of the texture is identical between the versions. Now, you may want to look into decal textures, which is again something we can sort of cover in these optimization tips later, but by and large the bulk of the content is the same. Similarly, you may have meshes that are just slight alterations of existing ones. If you're using single scene, our processors will actually analyze the differences and compress them together, so that only the differences between those two files actually get stored in the archive, and that will reduce the size a little bit. Now, generally speaking, in practice, in my experience having run thousands of scenes through our tools and getting a feel for what you guys have been uploaded, the file size savings that you get from this packed compression of keeping everything together is not that big. It's about 5 to 10% at the most. So typically, except in certain circumstances where you would be hitting an edge case, say for instance your region is all derived from textures or meshes or things that would fit that bill, which most of them don't, then single scene will only give you some very slight benefits. The downside to single scene is that you have to download all the content before users come into the region. Now, there will be some new features coming soon which actually let us get the benefits of the single scene, but at the same time not have to wait for the whole scene to load before users are actually able to enter the region. We've got a new streaming technology, and this will actually appear in a future editor pack as single scene plus. And that will actually separate out textures and a few other things, and we'll load the meshes and very low resolution textures as part of the upfront loading, but in future we'll actually have the textures stream in sideways along with a lot of other content that can be split out safely. The second mode that we've got available here, going back to our modes, is the multi-bundle mode. Now the multi-bundle mode is quite a clever mode, and what we do here is that we actually analyze every root object in the scene. So if you take a look in this particular scene, and I will use this one for the moment, you'll see that it's sort of broken up into lots and lots of separate clusters of the same object. Now what happens here in multi-bundle mode, we actually look at every single root object in the scene like this, and we see how much does it share with every other node in the scene. So it builds a map together saying that this asset uses this texture is used by these assets, and it'll build a big complicated map showing what is linked to what and how it should be packed. And what we try and do is we try and pack that into as many separate archives as we can. So what happens is objects that don't share any dependencies with any other object get split off onto their own. Objects that share dependence with each other, if they're big dependencies, and we define big as bigger than 80 kilobytes. So there's more than 80 kilobytes worth of shared data between the objects. Then those will get packed together. So you might end up with a group that contains your rocks and a group that contains your vegetation and a group that contains your walls. And when you're in multi-bundle mode, what we do is we actually send those down separately. So you can actually hop into the world while it's still streaming down the remaining content. Now, if you're doing scripted content or content that involves activators and things like this, this can be a little bit unstable. Specifically, the instability is that it can break linkages between items. So if you're doing that mode and you've got things like activators, the key thing to do is just group them into a parent. So you have a new game object as your parent, and then on your object basically assign all the bits that are supposed to work together to a single parent, and that way we'll never split those up when in multi-bundle mode. For the most part, if we are aiming for a low bandwidth environment, for a while we did several virtual worlds before we actually opened space to the public, and 2 of those virtual worlds had requirements where users were expected to be on 256 kilobit internet connections. For those, we actually used multi-bundle quite heavily. What we could do is we could get sort of the base scene into around 1 to 2 megabytes, and then have the whole scene sort of add another 20 megabytes on the side. So these are quite small numbers you're hearing me talk, and that's depends on the target audience. If you've got people in bandwidth constrained environments, a 256 kilobit internet connection will take, give or take, about an hour to download 100 megabytes. So if you're doing big environments for low bandwidth environments, your users are going to suffer. So multi-bundle is one way of ameliorating that, because you can actually get quite a lot of the content loading, and then as they're in the environment, the rest of it will start to appear. When you want to actually control multi-bundles, that is, say that one item is more important than another, what we can do is we can actually take, say, this terrain. So if we were splitting this in multi-bundle mode, what we'd do is the first thing, and the most important object in the scene, I would say, is the terrain. So what we can do is we can add a component to it. I'll just check that this is actually a root node before I go off blindly. Yes, it is. We'll add a component here, and it's called dynamic loading control. It will show up as manual loading control there. And this is a component that's specific to the multi-bundle mode. And what this does is that you can indicate basically how this bundle is packed and how it's loaded and what priority it should get. So the first thing you can do is you can set there is a required download. Now if you do this, basically the user will not get past the loading screen until this object has downloaded, and it'll be prioritized number 1. So it'll be first on the priority queue. You can have more than one object with required download ticked, but the user won't see the environment. They'll still see the loading screen until all of the objects with required download are actually present in the scene. The other options here is there's a priority offset. As you can see here, there's a little bit of a tooltip that it says that higher is higher priority. That means that if you want an object to load before another object, just give it a higher priority. So drag it up to, say, 10 or 15 or whatever you like, however you choose to indicate your priorities. And again, what will happen is that we will prioritize higher priority objects, load those before we start loading lower priority objects. So what you can think about is arranging your scene in ways that detail objects, say for instance grass, rocks, those kinds of things, tiny little details, are packed at low priority, and large architectural elements are packed at high priority, and that way those bits appear first, and we go from there. Now, the priority offset is further adjusted with a slight tweak that we do in the back end. We add an infinitesimal amount to the priority based on the size and number of objects in the scene. So large objects, or objects that there are lots of, we will add a small priority to as well. It won't override what you specify in that field there, but if you are leaving them all the same, then we will try and organize to get more visually important objects first. Again, entirely up to you. The next box on here is actually is cacheable platforms only. And this basically says that if there is caching available, which is true on most platforms, WebGL it isn't true, we will only download this object if the user has a cache available. So things like music, those kinds of things, which you may not want to force the user to download unless they're going to be there for a while and they're not going to have to wait for a repeated download every time they come visit your scene. That's worth having. And finally, the last option on here is forced cluster ID. And that forced cluster ID basically lets you group things together, the same way as putting them into a root object. So if you put them objects with the same ID, and you just enter any random number here you like, objects with the same number will load together. We will force them into a package together. That covers multi-bundles. Now, multi-bundles are good for splitting up into lots and lots of tiny little packages and loading them separately. The downside to multi-bundles is that because we do allow a slight overlap before we actually force the objects apart into separate bundles, that slight amount can actually add up. And if you're worried about really small regions, sort of like under 20 to under 30 megabytes, then you do need to be a little bit careful on how you specify your multi-bundles, because you can sort of add a little tiny bit of overhead. For most of the people listening to this, I'm imagining that 1 to 2 megabytes of extra downloading your content is not the end of the world, so you're not going to worry about it too much. We will have far bigger savings from texture sizes and audio sizes and that kind of thing, which I'm about to cover in a minute. The final mode here is called additive scenes. Now, this was a feature that Unity added themselves in the 5.x line, and basically this allows us to have more than one scene loaded at a time. You can actually merge all the objects together. So what we can do is I can create a new scene, and I'm just going to go, I'll save this one. So I'm just going to save this out as a second scene. And I'm just going to add a cube in here, or a sphere, as the case may be. So I'm just going to load up save this. I'm going to load up my Savannah. Now I believe that this is the way to do it. You go right-click on the scene, you click Open Scene Additive. And now what happens if you look down here in the hierarchy, I've actually got two scenes loaded at once. And as you can see here, I've got my sphere and some other things. There's an extra directional light coming in from that other scene. And basically what this does is it lets us drag and drop what moves into what. So if I want to grab these objects here, and I'll just grab some ones close to the bottom, just for simplicity's sake, I'll grab those, I can actually move them into the other scene. You notice now that I've actually got two scenes in here, one with these objects and another scene with that one. And this is similar to what we were discussing with the multi-bundles, except it gives you a degree more control, because you can actually move things like light maps into the second scene. So you can actually you can open up, and when you double click on it, it'll highlight the active scene. You can bake your light maps and things in your second scene, and then in your primary scene you can not have them, and that way when the second scene loads, it'll grab all the light maps and things separately. We do some of this automatically in the multi-bundle mode, just for reference. We do actually bake and save light maps to a separate mini scene in that mode, but in the case of here, you can control it more specifically. You can say maybe scenes, the order goes 1, 5, 3 or whatever, and you load light maps only halfway in instead of at the end. So those are the three modes. Now when you do the upload on this particular scene, so if I just go back to the scene settings, you can see that we've got additive scenes, and basically what that will do is it will use every loaded scene at the time of upload in the order that they are in the hierarchy. So in this scene's up here, so if you want that one to load first, move it to the top. And also keep it active. The scene with the scene save settings will always also be first, regardless. So you should always just keep that one in your first scene. Now those three modes let you handle streaming of content. The other one I mentioned before is the single scene plus, which will be coming in a future update, and that'll actually have some extra compression algorithms we're testing out at the moment, which may actually improve your file sizes by as much as 75%. It's a very big saving, so we're really looking forward to playing with that one. The bulk of your file size, however, is going to fall into two categories, and one of them is far larger than the other, and that is textures. Textures are huge. As far as the percentage of what your scene is, a texture will account for usually around 70 to 80% of your file size. When I look at a scene, typically what I see is 80% is the textures, 10 to 15% is the meshes, and then the remainder is whatever else is sitting in the scene, whatever it may be. Audio is another one. If you're using audio heavily, it can sort of seriously add up. So as I mentioned before, this scene is already pretty efficient as far as file size goes, and partly that's because it's got fairly low resolution textures in here. They're not bad, but they are. You can notice that there's a bit of graininess and a bit of pixelation on them, and that means that yes, it does get here as 30 meg. The big thing though is you can actually look at how your stuff is compressing. Now this scene, it uploaded at 34 meg. We could actually make this one tinier without actually derailing the visual quality, and the way we do that is we actually can select a texture in your hierarchy, and we can actually see here on the inspector there's this panel here at the bottom, and this lets you control how the texture is rendered effectively and how it's packed, and we respect these settings as part of our upload process. We do use them when processing your server. We read all this data out, and however we choose to compress textures, whether we use Unity's own methods or we use our own external methods, we do read these settings out and apply them from there. So you've got a bunch of options here, and I'm actually going to go through these because this is probably the single most important thing I'm going to teach you today. When you select them, you can change the resolution. Every increase in resolution there, see how it goes, it doubles each time from 34, 64, 128, is a 4-time increase in the file size requirements. So the difference between 1024 and 2048 is going to be 4 times bigger. So every single one of these is going to get quite a bit bigger. If you start using 4096 and 8192 textures, a 4096 texture typically after processing ends up at about 60 megabytes. So single-handedly you can get some really big file sizes off large resolution textures. You do have to be a little bit careful there. Now I have a sneaky shortcut around this one, which we'll get to in a second, but it is worth noting that if you are looking to save file size in the fastest possible manner, cutting texture resolution is the easiest way. Now, if you use our space editor pack tools in the scene settings, if you scroll down the bottom, there is actually this platform settings panel here. And this guy lets you actually specify things like the maximum texture resolution and also how to shrink textures on a global level. I'll briefly cover over this one. I know this is an important one, so I'll cover off the settings one by one, but there is more to learn here, and I think our wiki adequately qualifies exactly what each of these settings does in quite a bit more detail. But I'm just going to quickly jump back to my textures, because the textures, there's a few more things to go here, and once you learn this, it'll make sense what our tool does. So first thing, resolution. You can adjust this on a per platform level. When you're seeing processes in space, we take the heaviest output and use that as the basis for what your scene is weighed at as far as subscription. And if you're using the in-world build tools, how big the objects are to the end user, how much space they occupy. Those settings can be overridden on a per platform basis. So what you can do is, for instance, on standalone, which is the default desktop client you're all using, you can say the maximum texture size is going to be 4096. On the mobile devices on iOS, maybe it'll only be 128. And you can go through here and tweak them. And what you'll notice is that as you make changes to the active platform that you're on, down here you can see a little 1.3 megabyte, and that'll tell you exactly how much it's going to weigh in at before it's then recompressed by our systems. But it's not a bad estimate. Generally speaking, the ballpark figure it gives you here is not inaccurate as far as the actual output size will be. So the next thing we can cover off is the compression level. Now the default tab will actually set some individual levels on each of these based on how it's based on how you set these values. Compression is worth switching on. The compression basically dictates what algorithm it uses when compressing content. We use a bunch of compression algorithms which tend to be specific to graphics itself, so we use things like DXT and other algorithms which are kind of similar to bitmap formats. They're not quite as elegant as even basic formats like PNG and JPEG, they do a better job sometimes. The advantage of these formats is they load really quickly. We don't need to do a lot of processing. We don't need to hold up the CPU while we load the textures onto the graphics card. We can actually decode them on the graphics card itself, which makes a big difference in terms of loading content dynamically. So say someone's got a vehicle and they load it into the scene, we don't want to have the whole viewer lock up for 1 second while that vehicle loads. So that's the reason why we use some of these formats. We're doing more on background threading, and there'll be some more announcements and updates to come there at some point in the future. But to begin with, you've got a couple of selections on your compression algorithms. Now, the low, normal, and high basically dictates the quality level you're expecting the results to be at. So normal quality gives you sort of an average level of compression. I don't know if we'll even be able to notice the differences if I select find an object in the scene. So I'm just going to find one that's using this. So here we go. So this object here is using this texture. If I change this, I don't know if this will even be noticeable. Usually the differences are not terribly noticeable. So this one, the differences between low and high, almost imperceptible. There's probably, I doubt even you'll be able to see it on the screen. So going into low quality may be a worthwhile thing to do, because it will save a fair amount of file size on your textures. The next thing you've got is the crunch compression options. Now, crunch is basically applying a JPEG-like compression algorithm to it, so it actually gives you a fairly big savings. So this one here is 1.3 megabytes. Now, if we look at this texture, there's actually quite a lot that should compress well. All that black space on the textures, for example, will compress fairly well when we use crunch compression, but so will some of the other bits. So this currently weighs in at 1.3 megabytes for a 1024 by 1024 texture. If we apply a 50% compression crunch, now this will take a little while to process. Crunch compression requires a little bit of brute force. So there was some visual quality drop off there, but now we've cut the file size by 4/5. So this is now only 220 kilobytes. The savings there are fairly significant. If you do this across a whole scene, so this scene is currently 35 meg, 35 meg. If we had got a similar reduction here, and we probably could, my guess is this whole scene could fit in sort of 5-10 meg after applying crunch compression, so it's worth considering. Now, our tools, the ones we've got that I showed you a second ago, will apply this automatically for you if you turn it on. So if you go to scene settings, under your platform settings, you've got the adjustments on a per scene basis. You will want to sort of play around and tweak with all of them, but for standalone, we don't use crunching by default. So what you can do here is we can actually hit allow crunch, set a crunch level, which will indicate, you can mouse over, and these are all tooltips that actually explain exactly what they do. And that will basically crunch every single texture in a scene in a single go. So you just click that text box there and click apply compression settings. Go grab a cup of coffee. I'm not going to do it right now because it does take a second to run, but it'll go forward and compress and update all your textures automatically. And the big benefit of this is, of course, that users will be able to get into your scenes a lot faster. Not everyone has a high-speed internet connection, particularly outside of the US and Europe, and there is a fair number of users accessing from outside there, so it's worth at least considering them. And lowering the file size definitely means that you can fit a lot more content into your regions while keeping the same subscription level, so that's also worth considering. Now, I did say a second ago that there were some ways of cheating file size and getting big textures fast. Getting big textures and not having to sacrifice your quality. And the secret to that one is substances. Now, if you are familiar with Algorithmic's Substance Suite, it is a set of texturing tools that rely primarily on procedural texturing. They have two programs in the suite that are typically used. There's Painter and there's Designer. The one you want is Designer. And now, Substance Designer lets you build textures procedurally. If I open it up here, I'll just pull it up. You can see, I can show off the basics of how to build substances, but this is something that you want to go into the Algorithmic's own stuff. So what you can do is just, you pick one that's physically based with metallic and roughness. You can set the resolution to whatever you like here. It makes no difference. So what you do is you've got a, basically a, hang on one sec. This is going to make me register. Okay. I'm going to have to do this another day. I've just updated and I haven't activated this this computer with the thing. But basically it's a node-based designer. Go play around with it because the results are worthwhile. The second option is two things. There is Substance. There is there's a fantastic library from gametextures.com that's worth considering. Every texture they've got that's got this little logo on the top is built with Substance, which means that they'll be quite small. So if I grab some of these textures at random, you can actually get fairly complicated ones. Let's go browse through. What have they got? They've got some nice roof tiles that really show off that traditionally in the past procedural texturing has been kind of rubbish. As a general rule, the quality of procedural textures has been below the quality of hand painted textures. These days with things like Substance Designer, that is not the truth anymore. All of these textures here are procedural textures. They have not been painted. They're just built from a node graph. So if I grab, let's say, I'll grab something nice like that one. So this texture, you can see there's quite a bit of detail. I'm just going to grab this one and download it to my computer and bring it in here. These also give you the ability to tweak the textures in world, so you don't even need to have Photoshop sitting on the side. Now, a perk of all this is that, sorry, this is my new computer. There's few things that I've got to get set up here. So I'm just going to grab this texture I just grabbed. Yep. Apparently that one texture does not have its substance in it. Kind of ruins my my demo. Let's grab this one instead. Now, when you export these textures, these substance ones, you'll find that they're actually tend to be a lot smaller. Instead of being sort of a 20 meg texture or a 60 meg texture or whatever else, the actual output size can be as low as sort of 200 kilobytes or less. In fact, lots of them are. So we just grab that one. A roof slate in here. So just grab this one. Demos never behave. Okay, so we'll grab some from some other libraries, but Substance Source is the other one. These guys are from Algorithmic themselves. You can have a look here. These libraries cost typically a subscription fee, somewhere around $20 a month, so it's a little bit more than I think some people are willing to spend, but it is worth considering because you get a high quality library of substances which don't use much in the way of file size. I really do recommend them. The new Welcome Center we are using in the space upgrade that will be released hopefully today or tomorrow, I'm really hoping today, we're using substances quite heavily there, and we actually reduced the size of the region from about 600 meg down to 50 megabytes by converting things to substances, playing with compression and crunch settings. All these things mean that we can actually get a scene. That scene uses 2048 by 2048 textures, so typically those would occupy somewhere in the realm of 16 megabytes each. With substances and everything else, we're actually getting them closer to 200 kilobytes or 1 megabyte for these textures. So using a scene with 60 or so different textures and things involved, it actually is quite a nice perk. So these are the basics of finding out, of reducing your scene size. But the next question you've probably got is, how do I find out what's actually using my scene? So we've got a new tool coming, which I won't be showing today, but I will be showing in a future office hours. I think I mentioned at my previous office hours, which gives you a slightly better view into some of these things. But if we grab this Savannah scene, we've grabbed the space scene settings. Down here, we actually have two inspectors here. This got split recently, so you've actually got two. You can find one that'll actually measure the size of your upload, because things like PSDs can add quite a bit of file size to your uploads if you're using those formats. You can see that one there. Sometimes using things like PNG may be a smarter move just from an upload perspective. The output size that you will be measured out in your subscription doesn't matter whether you're using PSDs or whatever else. Also, our uploader will try and convert them to PNG automatically as part of the upload process if we can. That is not always guaranteed. If you're doing things like normal maps, we don't convert them to PNG because we don't think we can do it safely. But in other formats, yes, we will convert them. Nonetheless, the upload file size inspector is just a useful one to have, but the key one is the output inspector. And what we can do here is we can actually look at, this will give you a list of all the materials in the scene, and if we click refresh, which will take a second to run, or maybe not in this particular scene, you'll actually get a list of all the meshes, materials and things sorted by size. Now if I go into another scene that I've got, this is the scene I was going to prepare to. So this is a large scene that I grabbed from the asset store a while back. I actually used a bit of it in that Sudan region I built, sort of save this one. Give it a second to load. Now this scene is quite heavy, and the reason is that the developer has used a lot of maps. The resulting quality is nice, as you can see, everything's sort of slick and nice and interesting, but the file size on this one tends to be huge. Currently this one is estimating there's about 900 megabytes worth of textures in here. And you can take a look through here and see what they are. So we've got a 2048 by 2048 normal map here, which is taking up 21.33 megs. So what you can do is you can just click this and it'll select it, and you can see you can apply those settings yourself manually, or you can use our automated tools. If you hold control while clicking textures, you can actually add them, so it'll select multiple textures. This was actually built on the top of an open source tool, and we've got a big update to it coming soon, which will give you an even easier way of manipulating this and seeing what's using file size in a slightly more efficient manner as far as the window goes. But you can also select which game objects in the scene are using it and where they are. Now, if you're using PBR textures like this is, you'll notice we've got on every object we've got a normal map, an emission map, an ambient occlusion map. We have the color map, which is the diffuse, and we may have some other ones. We'll probably have some metalness maps as well. So as you select each of these, they're sort of, you can see they're weighing in at 3 meg there, 20 meg there, etc., and it sort of begins to add up. And that's because when you use on these texture slots down here on the standard shader, each one of those is counting separately, and it's not packing very efficiently. So something else to talk about is actually packing your maps. So each of these is loading separately right now, which means that basically when you look at this, it's got 3 color channels in it. It's got red, green, and blue to make the black and white texture. As a result of that, it means that all 3 channels are doing the same thing, and it's wasting file size. Now, compression will improve and grab most of that, so you don't need to worry about that too much, but you can improve this, especially when you're doing some like crunch compression over the top, which may not be more efficient when you've got all 3 channels. The Unity standard shader has been set up specifically so that we can actually pack maps efficiently. And what we can do in Photoshop, now this is a more advanced topic, and you'll probably need to Google how to do this if you don't know. What we can do is we can actually channel pack these, and that means putting, for instance, one of these in the red slot, one in the green slot, one in the blue slot, and you can actually get all of the extra secondary maps appearing in just one texture. So what you can end up at is one texture for the albedo, which is the diffuse one texture for the normal map, and then one texture for your metallic, your occlusion, your detail mask, and your height map. Those can all be packed into one texture. I forget the exact layout. It is available on Google, but I think the rough layout is that in metallic, yes, if you can see, the metallic is read from the red channel, the smooth